Hi, this is a guide on how to get started with adding React to a Django project. So by the end of following this guide, you should have a simple working React app in your Django project. And the reason I'm doing this is because there isn't a lot of official documentation on how to combine these two tools. So there's great documentation for Django, there's great documentation for React, but there isn't any official documentation on how to make them work together. And it's because they're completely separate projects. So why would there be some sort of integration docs? But for a beginner, it can be very frustrating trying to figure out the best way to get them working together. So what I wanted to show you was a guide that sort of has a minimal setup of how these two tools can be combined, while also trying to show you sort of under the hood what's happening without giving you any abstractions that you don't understand. So it's a very detailed guide, but I've tried to keep it simple as well. So this video also comes with a GitHub project that you can clone and use to follow along with what's happening. And if you follow all the steps that I do, it should work the same. And it also comes with a blog post that sort of details exactly what I'm going to tell you in this video, but in a bit more detail. And if you prefer to read things, maybe that's helpful as well. So there's both the blog post and the GitHub that are both linked in the comments of this video that you might find helpful. So with all that said, let's get started by reviewing what's in this GitHub project. I'm going to show you how to get started with the example project that I've included alongside my Django and React setup guide. So the first thing you need to do is clone the project from the default branch, which is part 1 initial Django. So you can clone the project just by copying this link and going to the command line and doing a git clone plus the link. Once you're in there, I'd open it up with whatever editor you want to use. And then once we're in the project, there's a README with some instructions that you can follow to get set up. So I'm not going to do anything special here. I'm just going to follow the instructions. We're going to go into the backend folder, set up a virtual environment and activate it. Install the Python requirements, which are just Django. And then run the Django migrations and start the server. And that's it. So now you should be able to go to your web browser and go to localhost 8000 and see this dumb little page that says hello world, and it has a button that says click me. And if you click it, it says you click the button. So this is like the smallest, simplest JavaScript application I could think of. And let's just have a quick dig through the code so that you sort of like know how it all fits together. So in here we've got the README, a git ignore, and the backend folder, which is a Django app. In here we've got the settings and all of that, and then an app called My App. My App is very simple. It has one view, index, and index renders the only template in the app called index as well, which is here. And inside of this template, we are loading a style sheet, some CSS, and we're loading a JavaScript file. And you can find those two things under static. So you've got this style sheet, which is just some very basic styling, and main.js, which is this very simple thing where you click the button and it says you clicked the button. And that's basically it. The only other thing of note is that the view is connected to the root path in URLs, and that's the whole app. And so what we're going to do over the next couple of sections of the blog post and the next couple of videos is adding React to this very simple Django app. Before we move on to adding some more complicated tools to our Django project, I'd just like to point out that you don't need a lot of tools to create a React app. So what I've got here is a simple counter page where you click count
and it counts for you. And this is all done in a single HTML file here, where we have our React mount point as a div. We're downloading React and React DOM from some external source, and then we're defining our React app just using some standard JavaScript. And the reason I think this is important is just to show you that there's nothing magic here about React, and all these extra tools that we're adding is really just making writing React apps more convenient. But it is possible to do it without these tools.
The next thing I want to do is just explain to you what the next steps will be. So there are 3 things that we need to do for this guide, which is to add Webpack to the project, add React, and then add Babel. And I've split these 3 things up into separate steps because I think each one in of itself is a little bit complicated and requires some explanation and understanding. And I think if we combine them all together, then it would be much harder to understand. And I actually feel like I didn't understand how all of this worked until semi-recently, because all of the guides that I've been following just give you a bunch of instructions all kind of smushed together where you're doing Babel, Webpack, and React things all at the same time. So I've tried to split them up so that hopefully you can try to understand them independently. And so the first thing that we're going to do is just add Webpack to this project without adding any React stuff. And so next, I'm going to show you how to add Webpack.
What we have initially is this one page where if you click the button, it says you clicked the button. And this interactive element is done with a little bit of JavaScript. This JavaScript currently lives in our Django apps static files folder as main.js. And it's just this 2 lines of JavaScript where we get a reference to a button and then we add an event listener to that button. So it says when you click on it, you clicked the button. And our goal is to move this JavaScript to a front-end folder and then set up Webpack to build that JavaScript and output it into our static files. And the reason that we want to do this is because later on we're going to add some more stuff to our Webpack project to enhance it and allow us to write JSX code and do various other things. So for starters, let's create a front-end folder. And in that front-end folder, we'll create a source folder. This is for the source code. And then we're going to create a new file, index.js, which is just like a standard name. And we're going to take our JavaScript code out of our static files and put it into our front-end source code folder. And so now the goal of the rest of this video is to just set up Webpack to take the JavaScript from index.js and put it into main.js in such a way that when we extend it later, it'll still work. So to do this, we need to go into our front-end folder, and then we need to set up our JavaScript packages using npm. So I'm going to start with npm init just to set up our package.json file. So it's created a file called package.json, which will document all of the JavaScript dependencies that we need. And then we're going to install Webpack. And I'm just copying these commands from the blog post that accompanies this video. And that will install Webpack. So if we have a look at our project now, in the front-end folder, we've got package.json, which documents our dependencies. Excuse me. We've got this package lock.json, which just describes the exact versions in a bit more detail, which is nice to have. And then we've got this node modules folder, which actually has all the dependencies in them, like Webpack, which we just installed. And so you might notice that Git is telling me here that it wants to add about 4,000 new files, and they're mostly node modules. We actually don't want to add them to our project. So the thing to do is to go into your git ignore file and add a node modules line so that Git ignores those files in node modules. Now you can see that Git only wants to add 5 or so new files. Cool. So we've got Webpack installed. Now we need to configure it. And we do that by adding a new file called webpack.config.js, which is a JavaScript file. And this file exports an object, which is this, which is used by Webpack to configure itself. And so I'll just take you through what all of this does bit by bit. So first of all, we have the entry point. This is where Webpack is looking for the source code, and it's in source index.js, which is that file we just made here. Then there is the mode, which is just a flag where you can say, is this development or production? And Webpack behaves slightly differently. And in this case, we're doing development, so I'm happy with that for now. The output, this is where Webpack spits out the results. And here I've said to do it in the backend folder, in the My app, and then in the static files folder of that app. You can see here it's saying file name is name.js. So it's just going to take this name and put it into here. So if this all works correctly, this should read in index.js, do whatever Webpack stuff it needs to do, and then spit out the output in our static files, which are here. So it should overwrite this file. Next, we've got the plugins. This is just some extra stuff you can add to kind of like enhance the behavior of Webpack. And the only thing I've configured here is that if there's an error, it shouldn't output any files, because why would you want that? And finally, this resolve section just tells Webpack where to find things that can be imported, because you can import files from other files when you're using Webpack. And I've said that, look in the source folder, which is where we put our source code, and look in node modules so that you can import libraries that we've installed. And that's it. That's the Webpack config.js file. Now to actually run Webpack, the way I recommend doing this is to use the scripts section of your package.json file, so you can run it using npm. And I recommend just doing it like this, which means that when you run npm run dev, that will go and find Webpack, run it with the watch flag, which means that whenever like a file changes in your source folder, Webpack will rerun, and using the config that we just defined. And that is that. So now we should be able to, from our front-end folder, run npm run dev, and it will run Webpack. And you can see it compiled successfully in some number of microseconds, and it's watching files for updates. So you'll see that if we go into our source file and save it, it'll recompile again and again. And so the code's being read from index.js, and it's being dumped into main.js. And so this is the Webpack output. It's a bit more verbose because it's development mode, and so it hasn't like minified any of the variable names. But if you look inside this eval statement, it sort of is very similar code to what we wrote. It's almost exactly the same. It hasn't really been transformed. And so at this point, this seems kind of pointless, like we've just, in a complicated way, copied the code from here into here, but made it look worse. So this will become worthwhile later on when we start to add plugins to Webpack. And so that's it for now. The test here is to go back to our app, reload it, and click the button. And you can see it still works. But then we can check our main.js file, and it's now the Webpack build output. So we know it's actually using the code that we put in our front-end folder. So it's taking this code, transforming it into this code, and then that is being used by our Django app. So now we've got Webpack working and sending our built JavaScript files to our Django static files. And there's one small problem that we need to fix before we move on. And that is that when the code from our front-end source code file is bundled and put into our backend static files, this file is going to be in source control. So when we do a git commit, Git will add this file. And this is a problem because this is no longer source code. The source code is in here. This is a build output or a build artifact. And the problem is that this code really is just a duplicate of this code. And you can see it here where we're saying, const button equals document.whatever, and it's written here again, const button equals document.whatever. So there's actually no new information contained in this file that isn't already defined by this front-end project. And so there are two reasons that this is a problem. One is that it's just unnecessary to have this code. And the other reason is that if this file, main.js, and our source code gets out of sync, it can create some issues that are hard to debug and reason about. So the thing to do here is to make sure that the build output of our front-end code is ignored by our Git source control. And so what I'm going to do is change the Webpack config to, instead of dumping the file in our static files, I'm going to dump it into a subfile called build. And then I will delete this, restart Webpack. And that should have loaded the new Webpack config. And you can see now that our Webpack output is being put into the build folder. And so now that it's in its own sort of special folder, we can git ignore that. And you can see it's sort of turned gray in my editor because VS Code knows that it's being ignored by Git. But the problem is now that it shouldn't load. Ooh. Yeah, so it hasn't loaded. It's not working anymore, and we should get an error, failed to find main.js. So the one other thing we have to change is to go into the templates and just tell it where to find this new file in build. Now if we reload, it works again, and we don't have that problem of our build artifacts or build outputs being tracked in source control, where they really shouldn't be. Now that we've got Webpack working, let's get React set up in our front-end project. So to do that, we need to first install React. So I'm going to stop Webpack and then use npm to install React and React DOM, just using the same commands from the blog post. Cool. And we'll see now that those have been added to our package.json and also to our package lock.json. They will have both been updated. Now we can add some React code to our source code. So I've just pasted this in from the blog post I've written. And what we're doing here is importing React and React DOM. And because we've set up Webpack the right way, Webpack knows to find both of these in our node modules folder. We've defined a React component called app. And you'll see here, instead of using JSX code, I'm using react.createElement, which creates a React element, and totally works. It just looks kind of ugly. And then finally, we are finding the root element in our HTML and rendering our app to that element. So if you look in index.html, you'll see that there's this root element, div, that has hello world and the button in it. And so this is all going to get overwritten by our React app. And there's actually a little test we can do to see this working. Let's just start Webpack back up again. And so the first test we can do is to just go to the app, and you'll see it's replaced hello world with our counter app, and we can count. And something you can do, there are two ways to do this. One is to press Ctrl-U and look at the source code. And you can see the source code of this is what is in the index.html file, which is the hello world and click me button. And so all of this is actually just getting overwritten by React. And you can sort of see it if we load the page. Although it happens quickly. It looks pretty janky though. And then the other thing you can do is if you go into, where is this? More tools. Oh, no, I should have thought about this beforehand. I totally forgot. Oh, there you go. You go into, what is that? The cog, and you go down. You can disable JavaScript and then refresh the page. And you can see what the page looks like before React loads. And that's a nice debugging technique that you can sometimes do to figure out what's going on. So the page loads, this gets rendered by the browser, and then after it's done, React in our script tag runs and overwrites it with our little counting app. Cool. And the one other thing of interest here is if we look at our main.js file that's being served, you can see that it's just filled with heaps of code now. If you recall before, it was only a couple of lines, but now it's just a bajillion lines of JavaScript. And then somewhere near the very end will be our, what was it, like click the, what was it, count? I can't find it. Anyway, our code is in there somewhere, and somewhere in here is React and React DOM. So Webpack has taken sort of our code, React DOM and React, and sort of smashed them all together into one file. Cool. And so now we've got React working, but the problem is that we're not using JSX, we're just using this react.create element. And so the next step will be getting away from this and allowing us to use JSX code. So now we've got this little counter React app working as a part of our Django project. And so we've got to move on to the next problem now, which is the fact that we're writing react.create element for our to define our sort of markup code in our React components. And what we'd really like to do instead is to write something more like this, which you might be more familiar with, and this is the JSX syntax. The problem is, if you just try to do this with no other changes, you'll see you get an error. Module pass failed, unexpected token. This means that when Webpack was trying to read the JavaScript file, it hit this div and it was like, what the hell is that? I don't know what that is. Now there's an error and nothing works. So I think this is our old file. So this hasn't emitted a change because there's an error. So what to do? Well, the thing to do is to add in Babel, which will allow Webpack to understand these JSX tags and transform them into react.createElement calls. And so we're going to set up Babel by first disabling Webpack and then installing a couple of libraries to help us do that. And I sort of elaborate on what these do in the blog post. So we're going to install all of these. And then we need to tell Babel how it's going to work, what plugins to use. And so we'll create a new file that configures Babel called babelrc. And we'll just put this little thing in here, which is just telling Babel to use the preset React preset, which we've installed alongside Babel and Babel Loader. And this is a collection of plugins that transform our source code from JSX into some like useful React code. So these sort of define some transformations which will be applied to our source code. So we've configured Babel, but we're not ready yet. We now need to update our Webpack config so that we can tell Webpack to use Babel. And so in here, we're going to add a new entry, which I'll just copy paste from my blog post. And it's called module. And this module rules section just tells Webpack if you see a file ending in JavaScript, except for the ones in node modules, just ignore those. But for every JavaScript file you see, use the Babel loader. And when the Babel loader is applied to those files, Babel will look at this config file to figure out how to transform those files. All right, let's get Webpack running again. And it's going. And you can see that this is running now. But just to make sure that it is actually working, well, I guess for one thing, there are no errors here. Webpack compiled successfully, so that's encouraging because it wasn't working before. But another thing we can do to just check that it worked is we can change our code to see if it worked. The count is, in which that's an exclamation marks. So if we refresh the page, you can see our changes have come through, which means that it's all compiling and working. And there we go. We now have Webpack and Babel working together to compile code for our Django app that can be used in the front end. One more thing I'll note is that with Webpack, in this source code folder, you can start to split up your code into multiple files. And I'll just show you how to do that quickly to close out this section of the guide. So let's say our app component, we wanted to put that in its own file. So we can create a new file called app.js. Oh, not KS, we need JS. And we can just pull this out of here. And we need to export it. So if you used create React app before, this sort of syntax should be familiar to you. But just to remind you, here we are exporting the app sort of object so that it can be used somewhere else. And in order to use JSX in a file, you have to import React, because under the hood, Babel is actually turning this into react.createApp. Create element, sorry, so react.create element. So this div is actually being transformed into react.create element, and React needs to be imported for that to work. So we've exported this app function from this file, and then we can get rid of it here, and we can import app from app, and that should all work. And just to make sure this did work, change this to question marks, reload the page, and you can see now that's working. So in addition to being able to use JSX now, you can also split your code up into little modules that you can import, which is pretty handy. I just want to give a quick overview of what we've done in this guide. So at the start, we had a single JavaScript file, main.js, in our Django static files. And the problem that we wanted to solve was to add React so that we could write React components and render a React app on our pages in our Django site. And the problems that we were facing is that we couldn't use JSX. We wanted to be able to split our code up into modules so that we didn't have to write it all in one file. And we wanted to make it easy to add external libraries, because if you're doing JavaScript stuff, often you'll need to use a lot of external libraries to get the functionality that you want. And so to solve this problem, we added Webpack, which allowed us to use external libraries and break up our code into modules. And we also added Babel to enable us to write JSX so that we can not have to use react.createElement all the time. And so once we had this set up, we were able to modularize our source code, break it up into different files, and import one file into another. And we're also able to install external libraries and then import those into our files and use them. And so I just want to reiterate that this isn't the only way to set up a React project with Django, but I hope that you now understand how this works and the components of this system. And just to finish up, I just want to go over the things that I didn't address in this guide. And so I think the elephant in the room is routing and code splitting. So I showed you how to create a single sort of little Django counter app and put that into your template and serve it as a part of your your Django app, but I didn't show you how to do that across multiple pages and how to split up your code or add routing so that when the user visits a different page, they see a different React widget. And so that's something that's not in the scope of this guide, but it's certainly something that you'll need to know how to do. Haven't really covered deployment either. I talk about it a little bit in the blog post, but I could understand if you still weren't really sure how to do that. And that's something that you'll need to know how to do to make your code useful to deploy it. Another thing that's good to have that's not in this guide is hot reloading. That is when you save your JavaScript files that the page automatically refreshes and you can see your changes immediately, which is very useful when creating user interfaces in React because it shortens the feedback loop. It means you can write code, save, and see the effects of your changes much quicker, which allows you to get more done. I haven't really addressed styling either. So there's quite a few different approaches to adding styling when using React, such as you can just use straight CSS like normal. You can use sort of CSS variants like Sass, which allows you to modularize your CSS, or things like styled components where you're writing CSS alongside your React. And so I haven't talked about that yet, but that's pretty useful when doing this sort of thing as well. And finally, this guide doesn't really cover data and requests. And that's, building an API in Django and consuming it from the React app. And so these are all things that I think are important to investigate while working on your Django React app. And I hope to cover at least some of these in future blog posts or videos. But if not, I encourage you to sort of do some research to figure out how to do these things so that you can be productive when sort of creating your Django React integration. Anyway, that's it. Hope you enjoyed. If you like this and want to sort of see any more videos that I create, then subscribe to this channel. And if you want to get alerted of any new blog posts that I make, then you can go to my blog and subscribe to the mailing list there. Thanks. Bye.